One of the first things Amber and I did when we moved into our new home was to buy seeds and starts for a little vegetable garden. We carved out a sunny part of the yard for tomatoes and okra and beans, and we even decided to colonize some bare spaces in the flower beds to plant some rainbow chard and kale, ornamentals that could adorn the yard as well as the plate. But a few weeks later, we began to notice other plants popping up in the flower beds that threatened to choke out the new leafy greens we just put in. Of course, in all likelihood, these were ornamental grasses that the previous owner had meticulously crafted in her landscaping. But to us, regardless of the provenance or the careful cultivation, they were weeds. So they had to go. And we ripped them all out, and we have been enjoying a bountiful harvest of greens for several weeks now. So if you need any kale, shoot me an email. I have some for you. But what was once a crop, these ornamental grasses, to us became weeds. Shortly after I graduated college, I moved from Alabama all the way to Berkeley, California. And one evening, I sat down at a really fancy restaurant in that West Coast city and was served a salad of dandelion greens. Now, that was laughable to me as an Alabama kid, to have to pretend that this expensive plate of weeds that I could have picked from anybody's backyard back home was actually Epicurean fare. But that's the puzzle, right? You find a dandelion in a meticulously manicured lawn and it's a weed. You put it on a plate at a high-end restaurant and that weed becomes a crop. Now you might be sitting at home thinking that there are some very clear and unambiguous weeds in the world. Invasive species like kudzu, that ubiquitous vine that colonizes so many of the roadsides in the deep south, and that smothers all native vegetation in its wake. We recognize this as a weed, rightly so. The country of New Zealand actually declared it officially an unwanted organism. Yet decades ago, it began in this country as a crop. Farmers could earn $8 an acre to plant it for soil erosion control back in the 30s and 40s. In other parts of the world, it's a food product. Its flowers make jelly. It's a legume that puts nitrogen back in the soil for other plants. And if you were to visit the studio of an artist here in Asheville, Matt Tomey, you'd find that he has transformed kudzu vines, that he goes out and forages into reed, which he then weaves into some of the most beautiful basketry I've ever seen. So is kudzu a weed or is it a crop? Well, I guess it kind of depends, because it's both. It's not always easy to tell whether something is a weed that needs to be uprooted or a plant that's worthy of cultivation. That line is often more ambiguous than we'd like to think, and sometimes as we grow and mature, our perspective changes on that as well. I wonder if that's partly why the master in Jesus' parable tells his servants not to worry so much about uprooting the weeds in his field. Maybe he knows that that line between the weeds and the wheat is almost impossible to discern. In fact, the particular weed he's talking about in this parable actually looks exactly like wheat for most of its life. It's indistinguishable from the crop itself. Maybe the master knows that whenever someone seems overtly confident and eager about being able to absolutely tell the difference between what belongs and what doesn't, danger and even damage is not far off. The servants, upon seeing the weeds, immediately start down a very unhealthy path. They seek to blame the master first, as if the seed he sowed in the world was bad. When they find out an enemy had done it, they immediately want to rip it up and destroy it, because they think they're doing good here. And anyone who has had a garden overgrown with weeds can understand why. But the master curiously refuses that offer, almost as if he doesn't trust them in their righteous zeal to distinguish the wheat from the weeds. He knows all too well that once humans get a taste for ripping things out, for destroying things, what may have begun with the best of intentions can quickly spiral out of control until nothing, good or bad, is left. And all that remains is a barren field where nothing is growing. To me, Jesus in this parable seems to be telling us that God would rather the wheat and the weeds, good and evil, exist side by side than entrust humanity with that sort of ultimate judgment. Because when we get to be judge and jury, our first inclination is often just like these servants: to burn, to go to the way of violence and retribution, to pull up death, no matter the cost. At the very least, this parable is a reminder that this kind of ultimate judgment is way above my pay grade. And so the master takes away these servants' power to judge and uproot, their ability to decide what belongs and their right to revenge, even when it's couched in the language of protecting and securing what's good in the world. The good news, of course, is that God's judgment has actually already come into the world. It's come into the world in the form of Christ's cross. It's come in the shape of costly mercy and forgiveness. And that's such a blessed good thing. Because so often the world is a confusing mix of wheat and weeds, of people doing the wrong thing for the right reasons and the right thing for the wrong reasons. The evil perpetrated in this world is often not done by sinister people plotting terrible deeds, but with everyday people who, for some reason or another, get skewed by the world or their own interior lives and actually believe that they're doing good, helpful, and even holy things. And so that's the difficulty in attempting to uproot the weeds in the world, because we wind up uprooting everything. Better, God says, when we see weeds in the world, is to spend our time and our energy cultivating the wheat, cultivating the crop, cultivating what is good in this world. And while I do think the focus in this parable is on some unnamed external weed or evil set against the people of God, I also think the same principle of the parable applies to our own internal lives as well. Just as we are not trusted with the judgment of others, so too are we not entrusted with the ultimate judgment of our own souls. Because we, like these servants, would wind up pulling up every good thing with the bad, never realizing that in our lives those two exist intertwined, side by side. Never realizing, perhaps until it's too late and we stand in the barren field of our souls, that what we initially could only see as a weed had beauty and worth just waiting to be revealed. Because what's important to the master in this parable, and I think to God, is not that the field is perfect or that the crop is unblemished. It's that there's growth. It's why he redirects the servants away from judgment and uprooting evil and toward the harvest. He leads them away from a mindset of scarcity and vengeance and security and toward a mindset of celebration and abundance. Because harvest time, above all else, is a joyful time. It's a time that gathers communities together in thanksgiving. It's a time that reminds us of our interdependence on one another, on God, and on creation. And during the harvest, it is so hard to be obsessed with the weeds, on what wasn't perfect in the growing season. As you're pulling up God's bounty from the earth and the fruits of your labor to feed the community. So if you look at your own life, or you look at the world and all you can see are weeds, and all you can feel is a desire to uproot, remember that our call is to growth, not destruction. To cultivate the good, not to destroy. Or as St. Paul would say, not to be overcome by evil, but to overcome evil with good. So let us remember the lesson of the wheat and the weeds, and the lesson of the dandelion greens and ornamental grasses and kudzu, that what seems to be ugly weeds can actually, with a little love and care, be a beautiful and bountiful harvest of wheat. Amen.